Hey, let's face it, we all want to be happy and free. But what we often don't realize is that happy and free do not line up well together. There is often a third element that is overlooked, and this is the element of constraint. This is not news. 3,000 years ago, the legendary philosopher and sage Lao Tzu wrote that clay folds to form a vessel, but it is the empty part, the free space within, that is useful. And yet, without the clay constraining, defining, and shaping the empty part within, it will be impossible to carry and store precious products. 2,000 years ago, the philosopher Cicero in Rome said that for a person to be truly free, he has to become slave to a set of laws, pointing to the delicate balance between law and autonomy, another manifestation of the constraint versus freedom polarity. More recently, Picasso advised us to first learn the rules like a professional and then proceed to break them like an artist, pointing to the same interplay between, this time, the constraint of discipline and of mastering one's domain and craft, and then the liberation associated with creative freedom and expression. But we don't really need to veer into the fields of philosophy, art, and history to see why constraint is beneficial. Look at what we are doing right now, right here. You are all sitting comfortably in your seats right now, and I'm standing here firmly talking to you. We are not floating and jumping around or levitating uncontrollably. And this is due to the most fundamental constraint, gravity, that shapes and limits and determines our life. So, as the only lawyer standing before you today, I will try to make a case for the benefits of constraints. I will share 3 types of constraints that I believe can truly elevate your lives, and I will use this humble ladder as a visual aid to help me elevating my arguments. So, the first type of constraint that can help elevate your life is commitment. And please try to imagine that this ladder actually represents train tracks, rails, okay? Try to imagine that this is a train track. And where do train tracks lay? On the ground, okay? So we have a nice train track here. Now let me introduce you to Fuja, a little story. Fuja and her husband Girish have been renting my sister's apartment for the past 15 years. They are from India. Fuja is one of the kindest, most loving, caring, and positive persons I met. A few years ago, my mother called me, she stays in the same building block with them, to say, Philippos, you won't believe it. Do you know that Fuja fell in deep depression? She doesn't come out of the house. I was so puzzled. She really desperately needs a job, any level, part-time job, especially, if possible, a cashier at the local supermarket. That got me thinking, how come Fuja, this positive person, this lovely, radiating individual, lost her smile? You see what happened is that her 2 kids left to study abroad. And this absolute freedom generated by the departure of her kids fell really heavy on her shoulders. She lost her sense of purpose, her commitment. She was a stay-home mom. And when they left, she felt completely empty, disoriented, uncommitted. A few days later, my mother called me and said, you won't believe it. Fuja found a job at the local bakery, part-time, and she reclaimed her smile, and that job rekindled her sense of purpose and life. So you see, sometimes we tend to think that being absolutely free equals being happy or being complete. But in fact, there is not much difference between absolute freedom and absolute aimlessness. Sometimes absolutely free means absolutely lost, disoriented. I mean, when you can go everywhere, how do you start? everywhere at once. When you can do everything, anything, what do you do first? The mind doesn't have the capacity to calculate all the possibilities and to solve all the solutions associated with the multiplicity of options and the choices that an absolutely free life can offer. And this is precisely why absolute freedom can look like a blessing, but sometimes it's a curse. And it can look like this as well. Too many directions. That's noise. Okay? Too many tracks of trains. Which way do we go? Everywhere, at once. So to convert the noise of multiplicity into a melody of simplicity, we need to sacrifice everywhere for somewhere. And this is where the power of commitment comes into play. Commitment is a constraint because what we commit to commands our attention, summons our energy, and harnesses our focus to the exclusion of everything else. So commitment is a focus exercise. We need to commit to a project, to a purpose, to a practice, to a process, to a person or persons. It can be our kids, our spouse, our family, our siblings, our community, our clients, our employees. Commitment gets us on track. And when we get on track, we generate forward motion. And forward motion dispels the anxiety caused by the multiplicity of options that can drive us into feeling completely lost. But a rigid constraint can lead us into obsession, and commitments without consent can lead us into oppression. So voluntary commitment is one of the fundamental keys that I recommend to everyone that can elevate their lives. Now, moving to the second type of constraint, I need to reposition the ladder, okay, and ask you to imagine that this is not a ladder, but that this represents a fence, okay? Those of you on the back that cannot see, I simply place the ladder as a fence, a vertical fence. Okay, so the second type of constraint that can truly elevate your life are rules. Boring rules. I know all of you are thinking that this guy is. But we see before that absolute freedom is not such a blessing, okay? So bear with me. Before I talk about rules, I will talk about fences, okay? There is an old proverb which provides that you should never take down a fence before you first find out why it was set up. And fences can come in many different shapes and forms. There can be a real fence. Say you visit the local zoo and you decide to free the tigers from captivity. Now, if you carelessly take down that fence, chances are you are in big trouble, right? Or you can think about the gate outside your house, another real fence. You want to keep it locked at night because you hope that it will prevent burglars from coming in. So a fence can be a real fence, but it can be a metaphorical fence as well. In June 2023, OceanGate's submersible with the name Titan imploded on the way to the Titanic shipwreck and taking all 5 passengers to death. The fence in the case of OceanGate was a safety rule, which provided that for deep sea exploration, the hull of submersibles has to be constructed out of solid material. OceanGate opted to use synthetic material, carbon fiber, which unfortunately led to the disaster. So rules are fences as well. For the same reason that you should not take down a fence before you find out why it was set up in the first place, you should not ignore or abolish a rule before you find out why it was set up or implemented. And there are other types of rules as well, like a law, for example, the law protecting the freedom of speech, which is in fashion today, right? The cornerstone of all free democracies. Or it can be a moral injunction, like treat others with dignity and respect. It can even be a business process, for example, that the company has to perform an internal audit once a year to prevent corruptible practices from emerging. So all these are types of rules, or let's say metaphorical fences that we need to treat cautiously. But even in the domain of games, we see how rules can veer and play an impact. In the game of chess, for example, one of the fundamental rules is that each player gets to start the game with only one queen. The queen is the most powerful piece, can freely move in all directions, and take all pieces easily. Now imagine if you were to allow both players to replace all the boring pawns and the limited pieces without much power, the knight and everything, with real or imaginary queens. So the chessboard is populated by nothing else but queens. Sounds exciting. Sounds like a great hack, right? That will kill the game very quickly, because the game would lose its beautiful complexity and meaningful challenge. So that keeps players engaged for many, many hours. I think the longest recorded game in chess in history has gone for 24 hours and 30 minutes. That was in Israel in 1980. So take down a fence at your own peril, ignore a rule at your own risk. When we take down a fence prematurely or carelessly, we engage in careless progress. But the opposite edge of the continuum is not much better. Actually, it can be worse. So the opposite of careless progress is blind tradition. This is where we keep the fence up for too long, so long that it turns into a wall, that it blinds us and it keeps us out of sync with the world. This is where we atrophy and we are led to stagnation because we don't allow ourselves to replenish ourselves with new information and with what the world has to offer to us. And to offer a counterpoint to the OceanGate example, that's a perfect example of a company that engaged in blind tradition. The wall became so thick, the fear of change was so fundamental, basically Kodak didn't quickly catch up with digital technology, and it became romantically obsessed with its film products. And it collapsed, declared bankruptcy in 2013. So on the opposite edge of careless progress, we have blind tradition, or excessive innovation and excessive conservatism. Both edges are unideal. We need to hit the middle. So rules are great, provided that we are open to their renewal and replenishment. That's the second type of constraint that we need to take care of. And for the last type of constraint, allow me to bring the ladder back again. And this time, I ask you to imagine that this is actually a scaffold, okay? That's not the ladder, it's a scaffold. Similar, but different in semantics and use. In October 2022, I visited Rome with my wife for the first time, and two of our best friends who are now in the audience. Now, when you walk in the streets of Rome, you feel that you're moving through the corridors of a vast outdoors museum, such is the cultural significance and the aesthetic beauty of the place. In the last day of our excursion, we booked a visit at the Vatican. And the one thing that stuck with me until today was the fresco in the Sistine Chapel, painted 500 years ago by the great Michelangelo. Now, one of the greatest limitations, which is the third type of constraint I'm talking about, that Michelangelo faced was that the staggering tall ceiling of Sistine Chapel, standing at 68 feet tall. In comparison, the highest point here is around 18 feet tall. There was no proper scaffolding to allow Michelangelo to properly paint the fresco. So the first thing he had to do, the first limitation he had to overcome was to build a tailor-made scaffolding made out of wooden frames attached on the walls to allow him to paint the fresco that took 2-3 years to complete. And legend has it that he completed part of the fresco lying on his back, painting next to his nose. Legend has it. So to get back to the experience of me and my wife and my friends, so I weaved through the middle of the chapel to get down and have a great and careful glimpse at the central image of the fresco, the iconic and biblical reference to the creation of Adam. Now, this image perfectly exemplifies the core essence of my talk. We see the dance between the limitation and potential, constraint and freedom, the finite and the infinite. We see yin-yang, and we see the pattern that runs through the life and runs through the fabric of our lives. On the left side, we see Adam, a vulnerable, imperfect, flawed being with a propensity to sin, to getting sick, to corruption, to betrayal. Limited in time and space. Reaching out to God. Omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, free from all constraints. Sometimes we think that our lives will be better without limitations, without getting sick, without having challenges, problems. We think that life will be ideal. But the life without limitations will be like a chessboard populated by queens, deprived of its beautiful complexity and meaningful challenges. Without limitations, there will be no need to struggle, no need to hope, no need to try. You kill the limitations, you kill the need for improvement, for growth. You kill the story. And the greatest stories we have ever told ourselves over many millennia are stories of overcoming challenges and facing limitations. So you remove the limitation, you kill the story, and you kill the meaning as well. And for this precise reason, the third type of constraint, limitation, is the pathway to a life of meaning. Meaning, then. And just to check whether you've been following my talk, what was the first type of constraint that I mentioned? Commitment, yes. The second? Rules. And the third? Limitations. So let me invite you to commit to a worthwhile vision while being guided by a proper set of rules, to remain on track, and embrace your limitations like the scaffold that will elevate your life and allow you to paint the frescoes of your future. Thank you.